1931, Lenox Avenue, Harlem. By the time the shooting started, the war was already lost. Not because Harlem was weaker, but because the rules had changed. This wasn't a gang war. It was a pressure campaign designed to make an entire neighborhood collapse from the inside. And once it began, there was no way to stop it. This is Episode 5, Blood on Lenox Avenue. To understand how Harlem reached that point, you have to understand what the gangster from the Bronx realized, and what a 26-year-old enforcer was forced to confront. What happened between 1931 and 1932 wasn't just a criminal conflict. It was, according to people who witnessed it, a war over fundamental questions about power, independence, and survival in a city that systematically denied black people economic autonomy. The stalemate that had defined late 1931 couldn't last. Both sides understood that. The gangster from the Bronx who wanted Harlem's policy operations had invested too much time, money, and reputation to walk away. And the African-American policy bankers defending their independence knew that surrender meant the end of black economic power in Harlem. According to later accounts, the violence escalated in stages. First came isolated incidents designed to demonstrate resolve without triggering all-out war. A policy runner attacked here, property damage there, warning shots fired to intimidate rather than kill. But warnings have diminishing returns. Eventually, according to people who lived through this period, both sides realized that half measures weren't working. The conflict would have to escalate until one side broke. By early 1932, according to police records and contemporary newspaper accounts, the violence had intensified significantly. Multiple shootings occurred across Harlem over several months. According to later estimates, somewhere between 15 and 20 people connected to the policy operations on both sides died during this period. Dozens more were injured. Property was destroyed, families were displaced, neighborhoods became places where people walked quickly and kept their heads down. The Amsterdam News, Harlem's leading African-American newspaper, documented the conflict in real time. Their reports, while careful not to explicitly connect all the violence to the policy war, made the pattern clear to anyone paying attention. A man shot on Lenox Avenue. Another found dead in an alley off 135th Street. A policy bank firebombed overnight. Witnesses who saw nothing and said less. What made this period particularly devastating, according to accounts from Harlem residents, wasn't just the violence itself. It was the erosion of the neighborhood's sense of safety. For most people living in Harlem, this wasn't a conflict. It was something happening to them. Harlem in the 1920s had been dangerous in ways that were somewhat predictable. Street crime happened, robberies occurred, but there were rules, unwritten but generally followed, about where violence happened and who was targeted. The policy war broke those rules. Violence could happen anywhere now, on streets where children played, near churches where families worshiped, outside businesses where people earned honest livings. The conflict between criminal organizations had spilled over into the community in ways that affected everyone. According to later accounts, this community impact became strategically significant. The African-American policy bankers, particularly Stephanie St. Clair and her chief enforcer, a 26-year-old man who had been organizing the defense for 3 years, understood something their opponent from the Bronx didn't. In Harlem, community opinion mattered, not in some abstract moral sense, but practically. If the violence became so destructive that residents turned against the policy operations entirely, then everyone lost. The numbers game depended on community participation. Without that, there was no business to fight over. According to people who worked with the chief enforcer during this period, he walked a difficult line. He had to respond to violence with enough force to prevent the operation from collapsing, but not so much violence that the community withdrew its support. It was, according to later accounts, a nearly impossible balance. Respond too weakly, and the organization would be seen as unable to defend itself. Criminal enterprises that couldn't protect their people didn't survive long. Workers would defect, money would dry up, the operation would collapse. But respond too aggressively, and the violence would spiral until police had no choice but to crack down on everyone. Or worse, until community support evaporated entirely. The chief enforcer's strategy, according to accounts from people who worked with him, focused on precision rather than escalation. When violence occurred, responses were calculated and specific. Not random retaliation, but targeted actions designed to make clear that aggression would be met with consequences while minimizing collateral damage. According to later accounts, this approach required constant intelligence gathering, knowing who had ordered an attack, understanding why a specific target had been chosen, anticipating where the next strike would come. At that point, violence wasn't the goal anymore. It was the signal. The community intelligence network that had developed over the previous year became critical. Harlem residents who supported the African American policy operations over outside takeover provided information that allowed defensive preparations and strategic responses. But intelligence and strategy could only do so much against determined violence. According to police records from early 1932, several major incidents occurred that marked the conflict's most violent phase. In February, according to contemporary newspaper accounts, a policy bank on Lenox Avenue was attacked in broad daylight. Multiple people were injured in the ensuing violence. The attackers, according to witnesses, were outsiders, men who didn't know the neighborhood and relied on aggression rather than strategy. According to later accounts, the attack failed to accomplish its objective. The policy bank remained operational. The workers stayed loyal, but the boldness of the attack sent a message. The gangster from the Bronx was willing to use extreme violence to achieve his goals. The response, according to people familiar with the situation, was measured but clear. Within days, according to later accounts, several of the gangsters' operations in Harlem faced similar problems. Not random violence, but specific targeting of his most vulnerable operations. The message back, escalation, could go both ways. Through the spring of 1932, according to accounts from this period, the violence continued, but began showing signs of reaching its natural limits. Both sides had suffered casualties. Both had spent enormous resources. Both were facing increasing pressure from law enforcement, which, despite corruption, couldn't ignore sustained violence entirely. And critically, according to later accounts, the gangster from the Bronx was discovering that Harlem was more expensive to control than he'd calculated. Every block required constant enforcement. Every operation needed protection. Every attack provoked responses that cost money and manpower. His other criminal enterprises were suffering from the resources being poured into the Harlem campaign. According to people familiar with the situation, this was exactly what the chief enforcer and the policy banker had been trying to achieve. They couldn't beat the gangster through superior force, but they could make victory so expensive that it stopped being worth pursuing. The 26-year-old enforcer who had spent the past year managing this defensive war had, according to later accounts, proven something significant. He wasn't just capable of organizing violence. He could think strategically about when violence served a purpose and when it created more problems than it solved. He understood that in a war of attrition, the side that could sustain losses longer while maintaining organizational cohesion would ultimately prevail. His reputation throughout Harlem, according to accounts from this period, shifted fundamentally during these months. This was the moment when survival stopped being enough. He was no longer seen as just an enforcer for the policy operation. He had become, in the eyes of many residents, a defender of the community against outside aggression, someone willing to fight to preserve black economic independence even when the cost was high. That reputation, according to later accounts, would define much of his future. But reputation came at a price. According to accounts from people who knew the chief enforcer during this period, the violence changed him. The decisions he had to make, knowing that people would die because of strategic calculations, understanding that every action had human consequences, took a psychological toll. He became, according to later descriptions, harder, more careful about trust, more aware of mortality, less likely to take unnecessary risks, but more willing to use necessary force. The weight of command, according to people who worked with him, was visible in ways both obvious and subtle. He slept less, checked details more carefully, questioned people's loyalty not out of paranoia, but out of learned caution. Every mistake had cost someone something: freedom, safety, sometimes life. According to later accounts, he also developed what people described as an almost supernatural ability to read situations, to sense when violence was about to erupt, to identify which conflicts could be managed and which ones required immediate decisive action. This wasn't mysticism, it was pattern recognition developed through sustained high-stakes experience, when your survival and the survival of your organization depends on reading threats correctly. According to accounts from this period, you either develop that skill or you don't survive. He survived, and in surviving, he became something different than what he'd been before. The teenager who had arrived in Harlem 13 years earlier wouldn't recognize the man he'd become. Even the 23-year-old strategic operator from 3 years earlier had been transformed by sustained conflict. The community, according to accounts from Harlem residents during this period, noticed this transformation too. People who had known him as St. Clair's enforcer now saw him differently, as someone who had protected the neighborhood when no one else could, as someone who understood that defending black economic independence required more than just violence. It required strategy, discipline, and the ability to maintain community support even during the darkest moments. Mothers who feared for their children's safety on streets that had become dangerous respected him for trying to minimize civilian casualties. Business owners who depended on the policy economy for their own livelihoods saw him as protecting their interests. Even residents who opposed the policy operations on moral grounds sometimes grudgingly acknowledged that the alternative, total control by outside criminals, would have been worse. This complex reputation, according to later accounts, would serve him for decades. It positioned him not as a simple criminal enforcer, but as a community figure whose actions, however illegal, served purposes that residents understood and sometimes supported. By mid-1932, according to various accounts, the violence began to subside without any formal resolution. Both sides were exhausted. Both had achieved partial objectives while failing to accomplish their ultimate goals. The gangster from the Bronx controlled some Harlem operations, but not the dominant ones. The African-American policy bankers had maintained independence, but at significant cost. It wasn't peace, it was exhaustion masquerading as stability. According to later accounts, everyone involved understood that the conflict wasn't truly over. It had simply reached a point where continued violence served no one's interests. But the underlying dispute, who would control Harlem's policy operations, remained unresolved. What had been proven, according to people who lived through this period, was that black economic independence in Harlem could survive when someone was willing to defend it strategically and ruthlessly. The cost of that proof, measured in lives lost and families destroyed, raised questions that had no easy answers. According to contemporary accounts, the chief enforcer understood this moral complexity. He had defended the community and preserved economic independence, but he had also participated in violence that killed people, destroyed property, and traumatized neighborhoods. Whether that was justified, whether the principle of economic autonomy was worth the blood spilled to defend it, depended on assumptions about power, survival, and dignity that people answered differently. What happened next, according to later accounts, changed the trajectory of the conflict entirely. In summer 1932, according to police records, the chief enforcer was arrested on assault charges connected to the violence. The specific details of the arrest remain disputed, but the outcome was clear. He was convicted and sentenced to prison. Some accounts suggest the arrest was legitimate, that he had been caught in connection with a specific violent incident. Other accounts hint at political pressure, with corrupt officials finally responding to the sustained violence by targeting leaders on both sides. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. The 26-year-old man who had organized Harlem's defense against outside takeover was removed from the streets. For the policy banker who had relied on his strategic mind and organizational skills, it was a significant loss. For the gangster from the Bronx, it looked like an opportunity. For the chief enforcer himself, according to later accounts, it was something more complicated. Prison, he understood, could either break him or make him stronger. It could be a dead end or an education. It depended on how he approached it. According to people who knew him during this period, he made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He would use prison the way he'd used every other challenge, as an opportunity to learn, adapt, and prepare for what came next. But that story belongs to the next chapter. What matters for understanding this period, the months of sustained violence that transformed Lenox Avenue into a battlefield, is recognizing what it meant beyond the immediate conflict. According to later accounts, the street war of 1931 to 1932 demonstrated several things. First, that black economic independence in Harlem could survive external aggression if defended strategically. The policy operations didn't collapse. The community didn't abandon them. The principle that African Americans could control their own economic destiny, even in an illegal marketplace, was proven viable. Second, that violence, while sometimes necessary in that world, had to serve specific strategic purposes. Random brutality created more problems than it solved. Calculated force, used precisely and with clear objectives, could be effective. The chief enforcer's reputation was built not on being the most violent, but on being the most strategic about when and how violence was used. Third, that reputation and community support were more valuable than raw power. The gangster from the Bronx had more men, more money, more political connections. But he lacked local knowledge, community trust, and the understanding that Harlem wasn't just territory to be conquered. It was a complex social ecosystem that required different approaches than his usual methods. And fourth, according to accounts from people who lived through this period, that the human cost of defending principles was real and lasting. The lives lost, families destroyed, and neighborhoods traumatized were the price of resistance. Whether that price was worth paying remained a question each person had to answer for themselves. The 26-year-old chief enforcer who went to prison in summer 1932 carried all of these lessons with him. According to later accounts, he also carried something else, the understanding that his life had irrevocably changed. He had defended his community and proven himself as a strategic leader. But he had also crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. He had made enemies who would remember. He had earned a reputation that would follow him forever. Prison would give him time to think about what all of that meant. Time to read, study, and prepare for the next phase of a life that had already become extraordinary. But even in prison, according to later accounts, his reputation on Harlem streets continued to grow. The story of how a young enforcer had organized resistance against impossible odds became part of neighborhood legend. The tactical brilliance he'd shown, the loyalty he'd commanded, the way he'd defended black economic independence, all of it became part of his legacy. When he eventually returned to Harlem streets, according to later accounts, he would return not as an enforcer, but as something more. Someone who had proven himself in the most brutal way possible. Someone who understood not just how to use violence, but when violence served larger purposes and when it didn't. Someone who had learned that real power came from reputation, strategic thinking, and the trust of the community, not just from the willingness to fight. The blood on Lenox Avenue had purchased lessons that couldn't be taught any other way. Whether those lessons justified the cost was a question that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. According to accounts from years later, people who lived through this period had mixed feelings about what had happened. Some viewed the violence as necessary resistance against outside oppression. Others saw it as tragedy that could have been avoided through negotiation or compromise. Most understood it as something more complicated, a conflict where both sides felt they had no choice, where principles and survival became impossible to separate. The policy banker who had organized the resistance understood this moral complexity better than most, according to later accounts. She had defended black economic independence and proven it could survive external aggression. But the human cost, measured not just in deaths, but in trauma, displacement, and neighborhood fear, was something she carried for the rest of her life. The chief enforcer carried it differently, according to people who knew him later. He had proven himself as a strategic leader and earned a reputation that would define his future. But he also understood that the violence of 1931 to 1932 had changed Harlem in ways that couldn't be undone. The neighborhood had learned that economic independence required blood to defend. Residents had learned that even illegal operations could serve community interests when the alternative was outside exploitation. And everyone involved had learned that wars, even when fought for understandable reasons, leave scars that last far longer than the conflicts themselves. These lessons, according to later accounts, would shape Harlem's approach to organized crime and community defense for decades. The street war of 1931 to 1932 became a reference point, a reminder of what resistance cost and what it could achieve. Blood had been spilled, and the cost would outlast everyone who thought they were winning.